Tonight on Talking Politics, former U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch joins Saraya Wintersmith for a wide-ranging interview on her tenure at the DOJ, the possible indictment of Donald Trump, and what's changed and hasn't since the murder of George Floyd. But first, to the state of the midterms here in Massachusetts and the state of the parties as well. So far, all of the Republican candidates for statewide office are trailing their Democratic opponents in the polls by substantial margins. Traditionally, it's been the moderate GOP candidates like outgoing Governor Charlie Baker who found success in this state. But in recent years, the Mass Republican Party has taken a giant step to the right, as we've seen with candidates like longtime Trump supporter Jeff Deal, who's vying to replace Baker. And it seems they're ready to leave the rest of the party behind, including one statewide candidate who might be the GOP's best bet for victory this November. Anthony Amore is pitching himself as a throwback to what the Mass GOP used to be: fiscally conservative, socially moderate, and open to bipartisanship. His biggest endorsers fit that description too, including former Governor Jane Swift and current Governor Charlie Baker, who's made Amore his only statewide endorsement this cycle.
I think he brings more credentials and qualifications to this job than certainly anybody who's run for it since I've been paying attention.
Amore, who's the head of security at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, says he'd do the auditor's job the same way Baker governed, by pushing Beacon Hill Democrats in a respectful and productive way. As he put it when he was endorsed by Swift in September.
That's what checks and balances bring. They bring accountability and better government. People of Massachusetts know instinctively that we need that balance.
At a minimum, voters seem open to that pitch. A Suffolk poll in September showed Amore trailing by 18 points, less than the deficits faced by other statewide Republicans. But after remaking itself in former President Donald Trump's image, the Mass GOP is less enthusiastic. Until recently, Amore wasn't featured on the candidates section of the party's website, and he's publicly accused GOP Chair Jim Lyons of undermining his candidacy. Still, the GOP isn't Amore's biggest challenge.
I am Diana DiZoglio. I was born to a 17-year-old single mother. I grew up housing insecure, and we moved around during my childhood, mostly between the cities of Methuen and Lawrence.
That origin story is just one part of DiZoglio's unusual background. As a state rep in 2018, she accused then-House Speaker Bob DeLeo of using taxpayer-funded non-disclosure agreements to cover up sexual harassment in the chamber. And she said it happened to her as a legislative aide. It was a political bombshell that gave DiZoglio a reputation for independence, and it's a big part of her current stump speech.
I was sexually harassed while working in our own House of Representatives. And the way that it was thought appropriate to deal with that harassment at that time was to fire me.
In hindsight, DiZoglio's decision to call out DeLeo seems like a perfect trial run for this race. She dragged embarrassing details into the open and showed you don't need to be a Republican to be a state house watchdog. Still, Amore might be able to tap into another ideal, a belief that even though bipartisanship is endangered, it's how government is supposed to work. It's a theme Baker has returned to repeatedly, including in his 2018 State of the Commonwealth speech.
What we do in this building is tied to something so much bigger than partisanship. We've done great work with you on many important issues, but our work has just begun.
Later that year, Baker won a second term. Later this year, we'll learn if that particular political formula still works. Joining me now to talk about what the auditor's race could tell us about Charlie Baker's clout, old notions of Beacon Hill checks and balances, and the future of the Mass GOP, our former Mass GOP chair and founder and president of the Pocketbook Project, Jennifer Nassour, and Lisa Kashinsky, the author of Politico's Massachusetts Playbook. Thank you both for being here. Jennifer, let me start with you. What's it been like as a former head of the Mass GOP to watch the party and perhaps its most viable candidate sparring publicly down the campaign's home stretch?
Well, Adam, thanks for having me. It's actually soul crushing is the only way I could really describe it. One, personally, because I gave a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to make sure that we enhance the reputation of the Mass Republican Party and also added lots of seats to the House of Representatives and ran great candidates. Now you see in 2022 a mass Republican Party that isn't even interested in democracy. And that's the part that's soul crushing for the voters of Massachusetts, because we all deserve a thriving two-party system. And the Republican Party in Massachusetts today, the chairman would prefer his issues being correct for him instead of thinking about what all of the voters need, which is a choice.
Lisa, some of the coverage of the back and forth between Amore and the GOP has framed this as a political cross that Amore has to bear. But is it fair to say that going toe-to-toe with Jim Lyons is also a political opportunity for him?
Yeah, it can be. And, I tried to hint at this a little bit in my reporting as well, is that this was, a bit of a choice that Anthony Amore is making to align himself with the still very popular governor, Charlie Baker, against a party that doesn't have a lot of resources and has leaned very Trumpian in these past few years. And that's something that we all know is not popular in this state. And to remember, this came up a bit in the package that you just aired, that a lot of this came over whether Amore would be featured on the state's website. And he had initially submitted a picture with Governor Charlie Baker for use on that website. And yes, the chair had said no to that. But then Anthony also replied, that's okay. I'm going to go my own way. I'm going to stick with Baker.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Keep going. I didn't mean to step on you, but that's an important point. And we may all know the sort of the backstory there, but some viewers won't. Were you going to finish a thought, or was that the end of the thought?
No, I was just going to bring it home and say that, this is both part the warring of the GOP, but also a choice on Anthony Amore's part to clearly say that he wants to be with Charlie Baker and wants voters to very clearly know that he is aligned with Charlie Baker.
And just one other point about that. It's interesting. Neither candidate in this race, DiZoglio and Amore, neither one of them has a ton of money, but Amore was getting all this free media or earned media, including from us at GBH and from you in Politico and elsewhere. He got a ton of positive free press over the past few weeks by doing this. Jen, Amore is pitching himself, as we mentioned in that package, as a Republican moderate, in part based on his relationship to former President Donald Trump. He has said he voted for Trump in 2020 as a protest vote because he knew that Trump wasn't going to win in Massachusetts, but that he called for Trump's impeachment, I believe he says, on January 6th, as the attack on the Capitol was occurring. Jeff Deal, the party's nominee for governor, has his own very close ties to Trump. He was an early supporter of the former president. He did a tele-rally before the Republican primary with him. But in the first gubernatorial debate this week, when Maura Healey tried to go at him over those ties, he cast him as no big deal. Let's take a look at that exchange.
My opponent is Donald Trump's candidate for governor. I'd be honored to be yours.
You're going to hear about Donald Trump because it's Halloween time, and that's her boogeyman. That's what the media likes to talk about, is Donald Trump. It's a distraction from what's important for this race.
So Jennifer Nassour, I'm curious, from your vantage point, again, as a former party head, what does it mean to be a Republican moderate in Massachusetts today? Does it depend on your relationship with former President Trump, or does it depend on other factors that are maybe harder to put your finger on?
So first of all, I want to just go back. I think that Anthony Amore actually said that it was wrong that Trump was denying the election. So at that point, he was kind of upset that he had voted for him. So I just want to correct that. But so
just to make sure, because I thought I was accurately recounting what the campaign told me.
It wasn't January 6th. It was when he was denying the election and said that the election results. So, but I mean, just wanted to correct that. But,
all right, I'll recheck my emails and make sure I'm not getting that wrong. So, okay, with that being said, what makes a Republican moderate in Massachusetts?
So what makes a Republican moderate in Massachusetts is the same thing that has made a Massachusetts Republican for all of these years. It is fiscal conservatism. It is making sure that government acts and reacts the way that it's supposed to, which is making sure that chaos stays at bay. It is not getting involved in people's lives. It is making sure that we all, Americans, Massachusetts, citizens, enjoy liberty and freedoms that we have been awarded as American citizens. And so it's not the social issues here. It's all about fiscal issues, keeping our families safe, keeping our neighbors safe, and being able to have opportunities, which include mobility, which include upward mobility, which includes everything that we see. And so that's what Massachusetts Republicans have always historically been and continue to be. And I just want to also point out and remind everyone that still 56% of our electorate, roughly, are unenrolled voters, and there are a lot of disenfranchised Democrats. So, we really have always had a message, and you can see from Governor Baker, that has appealed to the masses.
Lisa Kashinsky, if Amore and the other statewide Republicans, we'll see what happens. His race is closer, but he's got a lot of ground to make up. If they all lose in this election cycle and it's all Democrats in statewide offices, do you think it's time to put to rest the idea that those unenrolled voters and other voters in Massachusetts want a Republican or two to serve as a check on Democrat-dominated Beacon Hill?
I think we'll see a few headlines about that if that's the case after November. But look, this is a weird cycle. Massachusetts has elected Republican governors for the better part of 30 years. And then all of a sudden, Charlie Baker's not running, Karen Polito, the lieutenant governor, isn't running, and there's not a deep bench of Republicans to replace them right now. This also wasn't a very hospitable cycle to anyone who's a moderate in the Republican Party, given, again, the Trump ties that we've talked about and just kind of where and how partisan politics is here and nationally. Give it a few years. There are people waiting in the wings who could run, who are a bit more moderate. You can kind of thread that needle a bit more between the more moderate and conservative parts of the Republican Party and make that appeal to independents and maybe some Democrats. So I wouldn't write everything off after this year.
Okay, when you mention people who are moderate, who could be waiting in the wings to emerge after this cycle, is there a name or two that you could throw out that voters might want to keep in mind?
I mean, I think it's people who have come up before, like Andrew Lelling, the former U.S. attorney for Massachusetts, Taunton Mayor Shauna O'Connell. They had both been talked about a little bit this cycle. They can kind of thread that needle a little bit more. Their well-known names could be more well-known names in the future. Maybe see what they do next.
Jen, I want to jump to another topic here, another subtopic in this conversation. If Amore does not win this race for auditor, what do you think it's going to tell us about Baker's clout as he prepares to leave office? Because there's a Baker-affiliated super PAC that has backed both Republicans and Democrats, seems intent on keeping this sort of moderate spirit that you've described alive. How much of a test is this for Governor Baker?
I don't know. I don't think it's a test for him. I mean, at the end of the day, he's not running the Mass Republican Party, and he's not running campaigns, and he's not running himself. He's trying to finish out the work that he had started as governor. I think what this is a referendum on the current apparatus of the Mass Republican Party and the current party chair. And going back to what Lisa said, the problem is that we don't have a very deep bench because no one has been paying attention to this in a very long time. And we should. We have a lot of great people, other than the folks that Lisa had mentioned. We do have a lot of great people, but they don't want to run under the current leadership. And so I think that, again, this is a referendum on the leadership. It's a referendum on the messaging of the Mass Republican Party and the messenger who communicates that message.
We have about 45 seconds left. I want to ask each of you, if there is, and some viewers may fault me for, speculating about a wipeout for the Mass GOP, but there's, I think, reason to. If it's a bad cycle for the current iteration of the Mass GOP, is there going to be another leadership fight in the months to come, and maybe a reinvention of the party, a reorientation back in the direction that you think makes sense? Jen, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Lisa.
I definitely think there will be. Jim Lyons still has not sat a number of state committee members because he refuses to believe that they were actually elected, which goes along with his mantra of election denying. Again, bad for democracy. And I think that at the end of the day, you have 37 members, which is half of the members that are on the state committee at the current time, who sent a letter to RNC Chairman Ronna McDaniels just last week.
That was, and I'm sorry to interrupt. Oh, we're out of time. Remarkable development there. I'll hit Lisa up for her thoughts on Twitter. We can go back and forth and finish this convo.
Absolutely.
Jennifer
I agree.
Nassour and Lisa Kashinsky, thank you both.
Thank you.
Next up, in 2015, Loretta Lynch became the first black woman to ever serve as U.S. Attorney General. Now she's fighting for justice from the private sector, and earlier this week she joined GBH News' Saraya Wintersmith to talk about her new role, her old role, and everything in between.
Thank you, Ms. Lynch, so much for being here.
Saraya, I am delighted to be here with you and with WGBH.
Excellent. I want to jump right in. Right now, one of our local scholars, Larry Tribe, has told GBH News he sees no way that former President Donald Trump escapes jail time. And former U.S. District Judge Nancy Gertner expects Trump to be indicted. Do you also consider Trump's indictment a foregone conclusion? And do you think the fact that he still enjoys arguably a lot of political support will mitigate any outcome of any case?
So Professor Tribe is my former professor. And he certainly has learned it, and he's seen a number of these things. Obviously, Judge Gertner, very experienced. What I can tell you is that as a former prosecutor, the way that you handle these cases is by doing a careful and thorough review of all the evidence, all the facts, and then applying the law to those facts. So I will tell you that I think the prosecutors in the room would tell you that it's too early to make that determination, but what's happening right now in the Department of Justice is a review of everything. And there are things that have been made public. I guarantee you there's things behind the scene that are being explored as well that won't be discussed publicly, that will weigh heavily on those decisions. What you want is a process that takes everything into consideration, and frankly, the fact that there's political popularity or even unpopularity is not the determining factor in the resolution of a case.
And have you given any thought to whether or not, if you were still sitting in the seat, you would prosecute Trump?
So if I were still sitting in the seat, I'd be doing what A.G. Garland is doing now, which is building cases against everyone involved in, for example, January 6th, the insurrection that almost took down our democracy. So far, over 900 people charged. But I'd also be looking very carefully at the causes and the instigators of that insurrection, and we've seen him do that. So I feel confident that that's going on. I'd also be looking at any case that touched on anybody who may need to be held accountable for that. But it would be with a view towards making sure that I had all the facts, all the evidence, and then apply the law to those facts and make the decision based on that. And I can tell you that, you know, when you're in that chair, you do hear the buzz of commentators, the buzz of pundits. You have to push it aside. It does not weigh on him the way it does on those people who are listening to us today, because his focus is what his team is bringing to him.
I'm so glad you mentioned January 6th. Here in Massachusetts, we've had 8 people arrested in connection with their attendance at the riot there. And according to the latest listings from the U.S. Department of Justice, the last person to be sentenced initially faced 5 charges. They struck a deal, they pleaded guilty to 1, and I think they got 36 months probation and $500 in a restitution charge, and then like a $2,500 fine. I just wonder, as the nation's former chief law enforcement officer, have you had any concern about people getting light sentences for their participation, given that January 6th was what it was?
It was an armed insurrection, frankly. I mean, to think that we would ever see the Confederate flag flying in the U.S. Capitol was just a travesty. But whenever you have large groups of individuals involved in violent behavior, one of the things you try and do is look and see who's more culpable than the next person, and you try and have proportional sentencing. You know, I haven't seen those specific cases, but there have been some people who've actually gotten some fairly stiff jail sentences out of their behavior in January 6th. And the thing to do is to compare their actions to those people who are getting different sentences.
I was saying to you earlier, I think it's amazing to be sitting here with you thinking that you were the first black woman Attorney General in the United States, and that you might have been the first black woman to the U.S. Supreme Court, but you withdrew your nomination. Do you, looking back at it, have any change of heart about the withdrawal?
I think the right person is in that seat at the exact right time. And if anyone saw Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson and heard her discussion in the argument, her very first seating, then you know that she's not only a force of nature, a force of intellect, but she's a force of reason. And she's what the court needs at this very, very difficult time. Someone to hold up a mirror to people who are, for whatever reason, going back to these outdated theories of conservative judicial ideology and trying to make them fit the facts of today when they never fit the facts of 200 years ago. So she's the perfect person for this. And I will tell you that I would not have traded my time as Attorney General for any other position.
Wow. And how do you think you'd respond if a spot opened up and you were nominated again?
Well, that's up to the president, of course. And I think they've got a lot of people who, again, would be so perfect for that position, particularly in the voice of reason and the voice of pushing forward ideas of progress and equality that now is going to be more important than ever. You know, I look at Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson really as this generation's Thurgood Marshall.
Wow.
He was often in the minority.
That's heavy.
He was often in the dissent, but his voice still speaks loud today. He foresaw so many of these issues on reproductive rights, for example. You know, he talked about what would happen if, in fact, a woman's right to choose was curtailed. When it happened, as it did in fits and starts, he talked about the societal upheaval and the challenges to poor women, to women of color, the disregard for women's ability to make their own decisions and reason. He talked about everything that we're seeing now. So I think she's in that chair. She's in that chair, and she's exactly where she needs to be.
Immigration, another controversial topic as you were approaching the seat under President Barack Obama. I'm sure you know last month a group of about 50 migrants was dropped off at Martha's Vineyard, kind of making Massachusetts ground zero for the next phase of the political fight on immigration. I wonder, Madam Attorney General, some people will say that they can see a line from your time sitting in the seat to now that Republicans are kind of focused on immigration as a campaign issue. Thinking back, do you feel any kind of responsibility because you didn't denounce the president's executive action? This was a huge thing, again, during your confirmation hearing.
So the president's executive action during my confirmation hearing was essentially about DACA, and it was called DAPA at the time, which was trying to provide a safe haven for the hardworking people who had been in the country, living and supporting our economy for so many years. I think that, you know, when I look back at that time, I think what's the most challenging thing that I remember is that we were so close to bipartisan immigration reform in the Senate. And this is people from across the aisle who worked incredibly hard to try and make these issues come together and provide not just a safe haven for the DACA recipients, but a path to citizenship for deserving individuals, and then to have it fall apart in the House. And from that point on, we don't seem to have been able to get that similar congressional momentum going. And clearly it's there. There are people who've thought about this issue on both sides of the aisle and came together at one time to come up with some practical, real-world solutions to this problem. And when you don't have that sort of leadership in terms of legislative authority, presidents will take executive action because they're trying to move the needle forward. They're trying to get things done. But the door is still open. The door is always, certainly during the Obama administration, the door remained open for comprehensive immigration reform. There just was no one who wanted to walk through it anymore. And I think one of the tragedies of our country is that this divisiveness that has infected every issue has kept people apart on the issue of immigration as well.
I want to turn to your thoughts on more recent events now. What went through your mind as you watched people kind of take to the streets in 2020 over the issues of police brutality and racism? I'm thinking about Freddie Gray and that being your kind of trial by fire when you were coming on as Attorney General.
My first day as Attorney General was the day of Freddie Gray's funeral and the day that violence broke out in Baltimore. It was the first case that I briefed the president on. Where those issues and police reform and so many of the things that we had talked about before I was able to take office. So when I saw 2020 and the reaction to the death of George Floyd, obviously I was heartbroken like everyone else, and really had that moment of discouragement about where was police reform going. But I have to say, I soon became very heartened because the movement and the opposition spread beyond just people directly impacted by Mr. Floyd's death. And we saw people across the country and across the world recognizing the systemic issues that had led George Floyd to find his way under that police officer's knee. And it was a recognition that we really had not seen, I would say, since the civil rights movement in the 60s. It was national, it was international. There were people who had never focused on this issue before who were marching in solidarity with people who were trying to uplift Mr. Floyd's life. And that, frankly, gave, and it still gives me a great deal of hope. And I think that people will come together and continue to work on these difficult issues. And they're hard, but you do it on a community-wide basis. You go right to the communities that are struggling, and you find ways to build those bridges of communication between community members and law enforcement. And I've seen that done. We tried to uplift and make examples of situations in communities where it was happening when I was in office. And they were often places that had been through terrible tragedies, like Minnesota, for example. And they had worked, and they had really, frankly, pulled their way back from the abyss, and they had to keep at it. You have to have the tough conversations. You have to focus on the pain that these situations cause, and you have to have acknowledgement on both sides of the humanity on the other side.
Do you think America is in a better spot on that front now?
I think we ebb and flow. I think we ebb and flow on that spot. I think we saw great progress after Mr. Floyd's murder. I think we saw an awakening at an individual and institutional level that has begun to push the needle forward. I think now we are seeing people who are trying to send us backwards. And this happens every time. Whenever there's progress, you're going to get a backlash to that. Whenever you see efforts that really do work and really advance equality, you see someone rising up and saying, oh, no, more equality for you is less for me. It's not pie, right? There's enough for everyone. So we see that now too. But what that tells me is, frankly, the real change is being made, or there wouldn't be this fierce opposition to it.
I want to ask you, one of the results of those protests, like you said, was a new kind of widespread focus on racial equity, and you are now leading the Paul Weiss firm's Racial Equity and Civil Rights Audit Division, and one of your first tasks has been to review Amazon's policies that affect its hourly workforce. I think I read somewhere that the result of that work will be public. Can you share anything about where you are with that work and when we can expect to see results?
Well, we can't share anything now because it's still ongoing, and so obviously not able to go into that. But what I can say is it's a very important aspect of my practice. We try and help a number of people with the challenges of diversity and equity and inclusion in a number of ways. And one of the things that happened after George Floyd's murder was companies who were beefing up their diversity and equity and inclusion practices were looking for assistance there. We provide that. But also, stakeholders in this process, customers, employees, community members, shareholders, began to turn to companies and say, tell us how your programs are doing. Are you really having an impact? So we're helping a number of companies really assess the impact of so much of the work they've been doing over the past few years. And that's an important part of continuing that work and pushing that work forward.
Former U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch, thank you so much.
Thank you, Saraya.
You can find that full interview on our GBH News YouTube page. That's it for tonight, but do come back next week for a deep dive into some of the ballot questions that are up for a vote in November. And in the meantime, tell us what you think. The email's talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics, and you can find me on Twitter. I'm @ReillyAdam. For now, thanks for watching, and good night.
It's critically important to remember